things. How do I price my art? I think I should go to a retail store and pay retail prices for very small amounts of very overpriced materials, and then try to recap those costs plus an hourly rate. And that is how I will make it big in the arts. No, that is not how that works. That is not how big corporations have gotten big. It is not how that works, okay? Yeah, materials that are priced for the end user, that are packaged with all kinds of packaging, that are just overpriced, small quantities, that's not, you're not going to make money on that. Um, and so then, you might get smarter and start getting your materials cheaper. So does that mean you should price your art cheaper because your materials are cheaper? I don't think that works either. And then, okay, maybe one day the prices for your materials go up, and then all of a sudden you have to like hike your prices for your artwork, and then your customers are complaining and they're like, why are your eggs so expensive? This is not how this works, okay? And then let's go on to the labor part of the equation. Um, that doesn't work either, because how many hours a week are you basing your living on? Some people can only work a certain number of hours per week due to just their abilities, and then other people work themselves more hours than they would give any outside employer, or that any outside employer could legally require them to work. Art is an immersive process, and furthermore, an hourly wage works for the kind of work where it's like the same kind of regimented, repetitive tasks. There's like very specific parameters for doing this kind of work, whereas artwork is not that way. The work can be different. Um, it's not the same. Showing up and going through the motions is not going to necessarily produce work that you are going to sell, in the same way that showing up to do your job, going through the motions, can still you can still keep your job and get your paychecks and stuff like that. Art is an immersive process. Everything that you do towards your process is producing everything that you will ever produce. And so you can work for a whole month and come out with 20 paintings. And if one of them is like so much better than the others, but it also only took you less time because for some reason you were really flowing, and then someone comes along and they're like, I want that one. And you're like, okay, well, that was my whole month, and this person wants to give me, maybe that painting only took me 2 hours because it really flowed. And so they want to pay me for 2 hours, even though, this whole series that I did this whole time, this was like a month of my time. And then it's just the worst kind of piecemeal. It's the worst kind of gig work, because even with piecemeal, again, it's like this repetitive thing. You're doing the same thing over and over. You're making a certain amount of objects. They're all the same. They're all guaranteed to be saleable, but that's not the way it is in art. You might make 20 pieces and one of them, rises above the rest. And some people would see that and be like, okay, well, I'll just make reproductions of that, and sell 1 million of those because that was the one thing that worked, and so let me just keep making copies of it. The other way to look at it is like, this is an immersive process. I'm a human being. I am doing something that is unique to me. No one else can do exactly what I'm doing, and therefore, if you want a piece of my work, that's actually a piece of me, and therefore I need to be living on this earth in a sustainable way. I need to be housed and fed properly in order to create my work. And so you get things like patronage, back in the day, and I guess it still happens today, whether it's your spouse or your family or whoever has some property and a room for you to live in to do your work. Because it can be a lot cheaper to just keep an artist on site to work on a big project than to try to pay them an hourly wage. You see organizations bringing in a resident to work on like a large project. If they want you to do like a mural, they could not pay you an hourly wage to do all the work for that. It's actually cheaper for them to just, room you and board you for that time. Um, and that is, I think that's more reflective of the kind of respect for the immersive process that art is. And then you get people like Picasso, who towards the end of his career was doing things like signing his name to a blank white canvas, and it was selling for a lot of money because his career had built up to the point that he could do that. It wasn't like not anyone could have just signed their name to a canvas and sold it. It was like him. It was what he had brought into the world, the skills that he had mastered, the notoriety that he had, that he had curated through all his ideological explorations and whatever else he did. So that's patronage. Let's talk about barter. The benefits of barter cannot be overstated because, especially in America, most people have more stuff than dollars. You know, you want to sell your artwork, and people might really want your artwork, but they don't have dollars, but they do have stuff or services, things that they can do for you. And bartering, trading something for something rather than using currency and dollars, this can really benefit both parties, because somebody might have, some object or a service, and the price that they would want is like something that you couldn't afford, but you do want that thing. And, likewise, they want your art, but they don't have the dollars, but they can offer this other thing. And so, in my experience, both parties come out on top. Everyone gets more than they would have been able to get if they had gone through the US dollar system. And it's especially, poignant when you think about how the dollar used to be backed by gold. It used to be like you had paper money, you can exchange it for gold. But then Nixon was like, oh, actually, let's not do that anymore. We wouldn't want people to start hoarding gold. So ever since then, the dollar is no longer backed by gold, it's just paper. So, to recap, the other problem with charging by the hour is that if you charge by the hour, you only have 24 hours in a day. So that's going to put a cap on the amount of money that you can earn. It's going to limit you. Even if you want to give yourself a very high wage, you're still limited because you only have 24 hours in a day. Okay?